We buried my great-uncle on a Tuesday and moved into his farmhouse on a Friday, seeking the kind of peace that only exists in the imagination of city folk. The property was a sprawling expanse of land in Hemlock Grove, Nebraska, a town so small you could miss it if you blinked while driving down the interstate. The soil was black and rich, smelling of manure and money, but the air held a stagnation that felt ancient, hanging heavy over the fields. We arrived with a moving truck full of furniture and heads full of dreams about a simpler life, completely unaware that the simplicity of the plains often hides a brutal, silent complexity. The house was a white clapboard relic from the turn of the century, standing defiant against the relentless prairie winds that battered its sides day and night. It had a wraparound porch that groaned under the weight of our boots and windows that rattled in their frames like chattering teeth whenever a gust blew through. Inside, the rooms were cavernous and dim, filled with the dust of a lonely old man who had died staring at the fields he could no longer tend. It felt less like a home and more like a museum of solitude, preserving a silence we were disturbing. Surrounding the house on all sides was the corn, a golden, rustling ocean that stretched out to the horizon line, blocking the view of the nearest neighbor miles away. The stalks were 7 feet high, planted so densely that they formed a living wall, swaying in unison as if conducting a silent symphony for an audience of none. It was beautiful in the daylight, a testament to American agriculture, but as the sun dipped low, the shadows between the rows grew long and sharp. The corn didn't just grow, it seemed to encroach, pressing in on the yard. Standing guard over this endless crop, about 100 yards from the back porch, was the scarecrow, a grotesque sentinel impaled on a rough-hewn cross. It wore a faded, moth-eaten flannel shirt and overalls that had lost their color decades ago, stuffed unevenly with moldy straw that poked out like broken bones. Its head was a burlap sack with jagged holes cut for eyes and a stitched mouth that seemed permanently frozen in a silent scream of agony. It hung there, limp and lifeless, head lolling to the side. My wife, Helen, thought it added rustic charm to the landscape, trying to find the beauty in our inheritance, but from the moment I saw it, I felt a primal knot of revulsion. It didn't look like a decoration. It looked like a warning, a decaying effigy left to rot in the unforgiving sun by someone who had given up. The way it hung there, limp yet somehow alert, made me feel like an intruder on my own land, constantly being judged by something that couldn't see. We spent the first day unpacking boxes, the sounds of our struggle to settle in swallowed by the immense, crushing silence of the plains. Leo, our 7-year-old son, ran through the tall grass, his laughter sounding small and fragile against the vastness of the sky above us. I warned him repeatedly not to go too deep into the corn, afraid he would get lost in the identical rows, but he was drawn to the edges like a magnet. "Who is the man, Daddy?" Leo asked, pointing a small, sticky finger toward the scarecrow as we stood on the back porch drinking iced tea in the late afternoon. I told him it wasn't a man, just a bundle of straw and old clothes meant to scare away the crows from eating the crops. Leo frowned, tilting his head to the side in confusion, and whispered that the crows didn't seem scared at all, because they were sitting on its shoulders. As evening approached, the sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind picked up, making the dry corn stalks hiss and whisper against each other. It sounded like 1,000 hushed conversations happening all at once, a sibilant language of friction that I couldn't understand but felt deep in my bones. We retreated inside, locking the doors out of habit, though there was no one around to lock out for 20 miles in any direction. Before heading up to bed, I went to the kitchen window to double-check the back door, my eyes naturally drawn across the darkening yard to the field. The moon was full, casting a pale silver light over the crops, illuminating the scarecrow in stark relief against the dark wall of corn. It looked closer than I remembered from the afternoon, but I dismissed the thought as a trick of the light and the shifting shadows of the clouds. Sleep was difficult that first night. The silence of the country was louder than the sirens of the city we had left behind in Chicago. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like a heavy footstep, and the wind howling down the chimney sounded like a voice trying to get inside the walls. I lay awake, staring at the cracked plaster of the ceiling, unable to shake the mental image of that burlap face staring back at the house, waiting for the lights to go out. The next morning brought a harsh, bleaching sunlight that stripped the mystery away from the fields, but revealed something far more unsettling. I stood at the kitchen sink with my mug of black coffee, staring out across the expanse of green and gold, trying to map the geography of our new property. The yard was overgrown, the fence posts were leaning, and the barn was sagging, but my eyes refused to linger on those fixable problems, drawn inevitably back to the figure in the corn. It stood out like a sore thumb against the uniform rows, a jagged interruption in the pattern that made my stomach turn over with a fresh wave of nausea. I set my mug down with a clatter because I was certain, absolutely certain, that the scarecrow was not where it had been the evening before. Yesterday, it had been a distant speck, 100 yards out, marking the boundary where the yard ended and the serious crops began. Now it stood clearly 20 yards closer, its wooden spine planted firmly in a patch of dirt that I could have sworn was empty just hours ago. I rubbed my eyes, blaming the lack of sleep and the stress of the move, desperately trying to convince myself that my depth perception was failing in this flat, featureless landscape. I couldn't leave it alone. The itch in my brain was too persistent, so I pulled on my boots and walked out into the tall grass, measuring my steps. The air was still and hot, the humidity rising from the crops like a physical weight that pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. As I got closer, the smell hit me. Not just straw and old fabric, but a muskier, damper scent like wet wool and rot, emanating from the figure. The corn seemed to lean away from it, creating a small, clear circle of dead earth around the base of the wooden cross. When I reached it, I grabbed the main post, half expecting it to be loose to prove that the wind had somehow blown it across the loose topsoil. But the wood was solid oak, thick as a telephone pole, and it was driven so deep into the hard-packed earth that I couldn't budge it an inch, even with my full weight. There were no drag marks in the dirt, no holes left behind in the distance where it had supposedly stood the day before, just undisturbed grass. It was as if it had always been planted in this exact spot, mocking my memory and making me question my own sanity in the process. I walked back to the house, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and tried to mention it to Helen without sounding like a lunatic. She was busy scrubbing the kitchen cabinets, her face set in a mask of determination, and she barely looked up when I asked if she thought the scarecrow looked closer. "Don't start, David," she snapped, wiping a smudge of grease with aggressive force, clearly interpreting my anxiety as another excuse to complain about the house. I swallowed my fear, nodding silently, realizing that I was alone in this, that my unease would be treated as a weakness rather than a warning. Later that afternoon, I lost track of Leo while I was fixing a broken shutter on the second floor, and panic flared hot and bright in my chest. I scrambled down the ladder and ran to the back, shouting his name, only to find him sitting cross-legged in the grass, just a few feet from the scarecrow's boundary. He was talking to it, his small voice carrying clearly over the gentle rustle of the corn, having a one-sided conversation with the burlap face. When I grabbed him, pulling him away roughly, he looked at me with wide, innocent eyes and said, "Mr. Sticks says he's cold, Daddy. He wants to come inside." That name, Mr. Sticks, sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature, which was hovering in the high 80s. I forbade Leo from going near that part of the yard again, using a tone that was harsher than I intended, born of a fear I couldn't explain. As the sun began to set, the shadow of the scarecrow stretched across the yard like a long, dark finger, reaching all the way to the bottom step of the porch. It acted like a sundial of terror, marking the passage of time until the safety of the daylight would be stripped away from us once again. Nightfall brought a storm, a typical Midwestern thunderstorm that rolled in with bruised purple clouds and lightning that tore the sky apart. The rain hammered against the roof like handfuls of gravel, and the wind shrieked around the corners of the house, rattling the window panes in their frames. We ate dinner in semi-silence, the electricity flickering on and off, casting long, jumping shadows on the walls that looked too much like the figure outside. Every time the thunder cracked, I flinched, waiting for a sound that didn't belong to the storm, a knock or a footstep on the porch. I sent Leo to bed early, tucking him in and double-checking the latch on his window, which unfortunately faced the backfield and that damned Sentinel. He asked me to leave the curtains open because he wanted to watch the lightning, but I drew them tight, pinning them shut with a heavy book on the sill. "Mr. Styx is dancing," Leo whispered sleepily as I turned off the lamp, a comment that made my blood run cold and froze my hand on the doorknob. I didn't ask him what he meant. I didn't want to know what his child's mind was seeing in the flashes of the storm. I couldn't sleep, so I sat in the living room with a flashlight listening to the storm rage, guarding a door that I knew was locked. Around midnight, a flash of lightning illuminated the backyard with the brightness of a camera flash, turning the world stark white for a split second. I looked out the window and gasped, the air seizing in my throat because the field was empty where the scarecrow had stood that afternoon. Then the darkness returned, and in the next flash, seconds later, I saw it. It was standing right at the edge of the fence line, 50 yards closer, facing the house. My breath hitched in my throat as the darkness swallowed the yard again, leaving only the afterimage of that terrifying figure burned onto my retinas. I waited for the next flash of lightning, counting the seconds in the dark, praying that my mind was playing tricks on me in the strobe light effect of the storm. When the sky lit up again, a jagged fork tearing through the clouds, the figure was still there at the fence line, but now its arms weren't outstretched on the cross anymore. They were hanging loosely at its sides, swaying slightly in the gale-force wind as if it had freed itself from the wood that held it. I grabbed the flashlight and shone the beam through the rain-streaked glass, but the light died halfway across the yard, swallowed by the deluge. I considered waking Helen, dragging her to the window to witness this madness, but a paralyzing doubt held me back. What if she saw nothing? What if the stress was finally cracking my mind and I was hallucinating monsters in the shadows of my own property? Instead, I checked the locks on the back door for the third time, throwing the deadbolt with a force that made my fingers ache. The storm raged for another hour before tapering off into a steady, sullen drizzle that tapped relentlessly against the siding. I stayed in the chair by the window, my eyes straining against the gloom, watching for movement until exhaustion finally dragged me into an uneasy doze. I woke up with a start to the gray light of dawn filtering through the curtains and a stiff neck from sleeping upright. The rain had stopped, leaving the world outside sodden and silent, a heavy mist clinging to the ground like a shroud. I rushed to the window before the coffee was even brewing, desperate to confirm that the night's terror had been a nightmare. The yard was empty. The fence line stood unbroken and alone against the wall of corn. Relief washed over me, so potent it made my knees weak, until I looked further out into the field, past the boundary of the yard. The cross was still there, planted deep in the earth, but it was empty. The wood was bare, stripping the scene of its sentinel. Panic, cold and sharp, replaced the relief instantly as I scanned the area, trying to find where the straw figure had gone. I saw it near the barn, slumped against the sliding doors like a drunk who had passed out trying to get inside. It wasn't walking. It was just there, moved by hands I hadn't seen, positioned closer to our lives than it had ever been. I ran outside, ignoring the wet grass soaking my socks, determined to end this charade once and for all. When I reached the barn, I grabbed the scarecrow by its damp woolen collar, intending to drag it to the burn pile and set it on fire right then and there. But as I pulled, it felt wrong. Too heavy, solid in a way that straw and sticks shouldn't be. Beneath the layers of wet flannel, I felt something hard and rigid, like bone, and the weight of it was dead, dense, like lifting a sleeping man. I recoiled, dropping it into the mud, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I stared at the thing. I ran back to the garage and grabbed a can of gasoline and a box of matches, my movements frantic and jerky. Helen saw me from the porch, shouting questions I didn't answer, her voice sounding thin and distant against the rushing of blood in my ears. I doused the figure in fuel, the pink liquid splashing over the burlap face, soaking into the fake smile. I struck a match and threw it, watching the flames roar to life with a satisfying whoosh, expecting the fire to consume the nightmare. But the fire didn't catch properly. It danced on the surface of the wet clothes, sputtering and hissing, fighting a losing battle against the dampness. The scarecrow didn't burn. It just blackened, the burlap scorching but not disintegrating, the flames dying out within seconds as if suffocated by an unseen force. And as the smoke cleared, I saw the face. The stitched mouth seemed to have widened, the thread pulled tighter into a grin, that was no longer painted but physically formed. I backed away, the smell of unburnt gasoline and charred wool filling my nose, making me gag. "Leave it alone, David," Helen screamed from the porch, running down the steps in her bathrobe, her face twisted in anger and confusion. "You're scaring Leo. What is wrong with you?" I pointed at the thing, trying to explain that it wouldn't burn, that it had moved, but the words stuck in my throat, sounding insane even to my own ears. That night, the atmosphere in the house shifted from tense to oppressive. The air felt thick, charged with static electricity. We ate dinner in silence again, Helen refusing to look at me, focusing entirely on feeding Leo, who was unusually quiet. After they went to bed, I sat in the kitchen with a baseball bat across my knees, the only weapon I could find. Around 2 a.m., I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping on the glass of the back door, followed by a voice that sounded like dry leaves scraping over concrete. Cold. So cold. The voice paralyzed me, freezing the blood in my veins with a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. It wasn't loud, it was barely a whisper, but it carried through the thick oak door as if the wood were nothing but paper. I gripped the baseball bat so hard my knuckles turned white. My eyes locked on the frosted glass pane of the back door, waiting for a silhouette to appear. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking, betraying the terror that was gripping my throat. There was no answer, just the silence of the house settling around me, heavy and suffocating. I stood up slowly, my legs trembling, and crept toward the door, feeling like an intruder in my own home. I reached for the porch light switch and flicked it on, bracing myself for whatever horror might be revealed on the other side. The yellow bulb illuminated the empty porch steps and the swath of darkness beyond, revealing nothing but the rain-slicked wood and the swaying corn in the distance. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, leaning my forehead against the cool doorframe, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or a prank by some local kids. But as I turned to go back to my chair, I heard a sound that stopped my heart cold, a slow, deliberate creak from the floorboards directly above me. It was coming from Leo's room. I took the stairs 2 at a time, the bat raised, fear for my son overriding the fear for myself. I burst into his room, flicking the light switch, ready to swing at anything that moved. Leo was sitting up in bed, his eyes wide and glassy, staring at the window. The window was closed, but the latch was undone, hanging loosely in the open position, swaying slightly with a draft I couldn't feel. "Leo, are you okay?" I asked, rushing to his side, checking him for any sign of harm. He didn't look at me. His gaze remained fixed on the dark glass, his small hands clutching the duvet tightly to his chest. "He came in, Daddy," Leo whispered, his voice devoid of emotion, sounding eerily calm. "Mr. Sticks came in to get warm." I spun around, scanning the room, checking the closet under the bed behind the door, but the room was empty. "There's no one here, Leo. It was just a bad dream," I said, trying to soothe him, but my own voice lacked conviction. Then I saw it. On the floor near the foot of the bed was a small pile of dried corn husks and a smudge of black, oily mud. I grabbed Leo and carried him into our bedroom, waking Helen with a frantic urgency that finally broke through her denial. "Someone was in his room," I hissed, showing her the mud on my hand, the undeniable proof of an intruder. She looked at me, then at Leo, her face paling as the reality of the situation began to sink in. We locked the bedroom door, pushed the dresser against it, and huddled together on the bed, waiting for the dawn like castaways waiting for a rescue ship. The next morning, the sun revealed a trail of muddy footprints leading from the back door, which was now unlocked, through the kitchen, up the stairs, and into Leo's room. The footprints were strange. They weren't shaped like boots or shoes. They were rectangular, undefined blotches, as if someone had wrapped their feet in rags or burlap, and they didn't lead out. They stopped in the middle of Leo's room. I called the police, my hands shaking as I dialed the number, reporting a break-in. 2 deputies arrived an hour later, looking bored and skeptical, listening to my story with half-hearted interest. They walked the perimeter, checked the doors, and told me it was probably just a drifter looking for shelter. Or maybe an animal. When I showed them the scarecrow, which was now back on its cross in the field, motionless, they just chuckled and told me to get a dog. They didn't see what I saw. As they drove away, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake, I looked at the scarecrow through binoculars. Its head was tilted differently now, angled slightly downward, as if it were watching the house with renewed interest. And on its chest, pinned to the faded flannel shirt with a rusty nail, was something blue. It was a piece of fabric. It was a piece of Leo's pajamas. I packed the car within the hour, throwing clothes into suitcases haphazardly, telling Helen we were going to stay at a motel in the next town until I could install a security system. She didn't argue this time. The footprints had shattered her denial. We drove away, the house receding in the rearview mirror, looking innocent and peaceful in the daylight. But as we turned onto the main road, I glanced at the cornfield one last time. The cross was empty again. We drove in silence, the tension in the car thick enough to choke on. Leo strapped into his booster seat in the back, staring blankly out the window at the passing rows of corn. The endless green walls blurred into a dizzying tunnel, the monotony of the landscape doing nothing to calm the racing of my heart. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure running behind us, keeping pace with the car. But the road remained empty, a ribbon of gray asphalt stretching out to the horizon. We were 10 miles out of town when the engine sputtered, a cough, a shudder, and then a sickening silence as the power steering died in my hands. I wrestled the car to the shoulder, cursing under my breath, my knuckles white on the steering wheel as we coasted to a stop in the middle of nowhere. "What's happening?" Helen asked, her voice edged with rising panic, turning to look at me with wide, fearful eyes. "Just a stall, probably the fuel pump," I lied, trying to sound confident as I unbuckled my seatbelt and stepped out into the stifling afternoon heat. I popped the hood, steam hissing from the radiator, but even as I stared at the engine, I knew this wasn't a mechanical failure. The silence of the road was absolute. No birds, no crickets, not even the sound of the wind. Just the ticking of the cooling engine and the blood pounding in my ears. I walked around to the trunk to get the emergency water, my eyes scanning the cornfields on either side of the road. That's when I saw it. Standing in the first row of corn, not 20 feet from the car, was the scarecrow. It wasn't on a cross, it was standing on its own 2 legs, leaning casually against a stalk as if waiting for a bus. I froze, the water jug slipping from my fingers and bursting on the asphalt, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet. It hadn't followed us. It had anticipated us. It was ahead of us. The burlap face was motionless, the stitched mouth still frozen in that grotesque grin, but the head slowly turned to track me as I scrambled back toward the driver's door. "Lock the doors!" I screamed at Helen, throwing myself into the seat and slamming the door shut just as a thud echoed against the metal of the trunk. I turned the key frantically, the engine whining and clicking but refusing to catch, sounding like a dying animal. "David, what is it? What did you see?" Helen cried, reaching for Leo in the back seat as a shadow fell over the rear window. I looked in the mirror and saw it. The scarecrow was climbing onto the trunk of the car, its movements jerky and unnatural, limbs bending at angles that defied anatomy. Straw and dust rained down onto the glass as it crawled toward the roof. "Get down!" I yelled, shielding Helen with my arm as the sunroof shattered inward, a shower of tempered glass raining down on us. A hand made of twisted twigs and old leather gloves reached into the cabin, groping blindly for anything it could grab. It snagged Helen's hair, pulling her head back with a vicious jerk, and she screamed, a sound of pure terror that tore through me. I grabbed the tire iron from under the seat and swung it wildly, smashing the gloved hand until it released her, retreating back onto the roof with a dry, rustling hiss. The car rocked violently from side to side as the thing jumped off, landing on the hood with a heavy crunch that buckled the metal. It stared at us through the windshield, crouched on all fours like a spider, its burlap face inches from the glass. Up close, I could see the eyes, not holes, but something wet and dark glistening behind the burlap mesh, moving independently. It raised a fist to smash the windshield, and I knew the safety glass wouldn't hold for long against that kind of strength. "We have to run," I whispered to Helen, my voice trembling but my mind strangely clear with the adrenaline of survival. "Into the corn. It's the only cover." It was a terrible plan, running into the creature's domain, but staying in the metal coffin of the car was suicide. "On 3. "You take Leo. I'll distract it." I gripped the tire iron, watching the spiderweb cracks spreading across the windshield with every blow the scarecrow landed. 1, 2, 3. I kicked my door open and rolled out onto the pavement, yelling at the top of my lungs to draw its attention. The creature snapped its head toward me, abandoning the windshield and leaping off the hood with terrifying agility. I swung the tire iron, connecting with its midsection, but it felt like hitting a bag of cement, dense and unyielding. The impact jarred my arm all the way to the shoulder, and the thing didn't even flinch. It backhanded me, a blow that sent me sprawling across the asphalt, the taste of blood filling my mouth. As I scrambled to get up, I saw Helen and Leo sprinting into the corn on the opposite side of the road, disappearing into the green wall. The scarecrow looked at them, then back at me, tilting its head in a mockery of decision. It chose me. It lunged, tackling me into the ditch, its straw-filled weight pinning me down as those twig fingers closed around my throat. The fingers were dry and rough, scratching against my skin like sandpaper, but the grip was iron. I thrashed in the ditch water, muddy slime coating my back, kicking and clawing at the burlap sack that served as a face. The smell was overpowering now, rot, old earth, and something metallic like dried blood. As my vision began to tunnel, darkening at the edges from the lack of oxygen, I saw the stitching on its mouth begin to tear. The thread snapped one by one, revealing a maw beneath the burlap that was filled not with straw, but with rows of jagged yellow corn kernels that looked disturbingly like teeth. My hand scrabbled in the mud for a weapon, finding only a jagged rock the size of a fist. With the last reserve of my strength, fueled by the primal urge to see my son again, I brought the rock down on the side of its head. There was a sickening crunch, like breaking a dry branch, and the creature recoiled, loosening its grip just enough for me to suck in a ragged breath of air. I didn't wait to see the damage. I rolled out from under it, scrambling up the embankment on hands and knees, my lungs burning. I ran into the corn after Helen and Leo, the stalks whipping against my face and arms, leaving stinging cuts. "Helen!" I screamed, my voice raw, stumbling over the uneven furrows of the earth. I heard a rustling behind me, heavy and fast. It wasn't stalking anymore, it was hunting. The corn seemed to close in around me, the rows shifting to confuse my path, a labyrinth designed to keep me there forever. I burst into a small clearing, a circle of flattened crops, and found Helen huddled on the ground, clutching Leo so tight he was crying. "It's coming," she sobbed, looking past me at the wall of green I had just broken through. I grabbed them both, pulling them to their feet. "Keep moving, don't look back!" We ran blindly, having lost all sense of direction, guided only by the fear that snapped at our heels. Suddenly, the ground beneath us gave way. We tumbled down a steep incline, sliding through mud and roots, landing in a heap at the bottom of a dry creek bed. Above us, silhouetted against the darkening sky, the scarecrow stood at the edge of the ravine. It didn't follow us down. It just watched, motionless. Then slowly it raised its arm and pointed, not at us, but back toward the farmhouse in the distance. I looked in the direction it was pointing and saw smoke rising, thick black plumes curling into the sky. It wasn't the house burning. It was the barn, and in the flames I could see shapes, dozens of them. Other scarecrows emerging from the fire, walking out into the fields. We hadn't been fighting one monster. We had been fighting the guardian, the one that kept the others in. And I had tried to burn it. We didn't stop running until we hit the interstate miles away, flagging down a passing trucker who looked at our muddy, bloodied clothes with suspicion but let us in anyway. We left the car, the clothes, everything we owned on that roadside. We never went back to Hemlock Grove. The bank foreclosed on the property a few months later, sending us letters about abandonment and vandalism that we threw into the trash without opening. We live in the city now, on the 16th floor of a high-rise far away from anything that grows. I work in an office with no windows, but sometimes when I buy groceries I see it. In the produce aisle, a stray husk of corn on the floor, or the smell of wet straw when it rains. And last week, Leo drew a picture in school. It was our family, standing tall and happy. But in the background, filling the entire page with black crayon scribbles, were rows and rows of tall green sticks. And when I asked him what they were, he didn't look up from his paper. He just smiled a smile that was a little too wide and said, "The watchers, Daddy. They're waiting for the harvest."